So welcome, folks. It's my great pleasure, and I only found out this morning, to kick off the EMCC Global Provider Summit for 2021, because Asia Pacific is the first time zone to come around to Monday. We're it. It's a bit like the New Year celebrations, isn't it? When the New Year comes around in Auckland first, and then we get to Sydney and so on. I remember, you'll tell from my accent, I'm from the UK originally. I always remember seeing that on the late night news at home. So yeah, welcome to this week-long event. I have no official role with the EMCC to introduce this. It's just nice to be able to mention that as we start. So it's supposed to be a roundtable discussion. That's the way it was positioned, or a dialogue. And we're all obviously in different fields of coaching and mentoring, different contexts where we're doing our work. And what will be fascinating for me today, I work solely in the education context, and taking education in its broadest context from preschool right through to tertiary, and some inquiries now in higher education as well. But that's kind of our kind of lane at Growth Coaching International. And it'll be interesting for me just to hear your perspectives, the work you might be doing in similar contexts around the globe and in Australia. And other contexts, and you may be here just out of an interest. You may be predominantly coaching in other areas. So just when I start introducing me, I'll do a bit of introduction, then I want to see where you're from and ask you to post some comments and things in the chat box. And we're going to explore this context of coaching in education. So I'm just going to grab the slides and share a little bit with you just now, just to kick this off. And I'll try my best to multitask. This has been our world for a little bit longer than we wanted it to be now, but I'll try and keep an eye on the waiting room and things as we go. So yeah, coaching and mentoring in educational contexts is what I've decided to present to you, as I've said already, because this is the key area where GCI operates. Still just getting my slides organized in the background. Yeah, trying to keep an eye on the waiting room at the same time. This is actually coming up now 19 years. Next year's our 20th anniversary at Growth Coaching International. From what was a around the kitchen table business to start with as Australian growth coaching. And I've got John Campbell's just arrived and joined us there. John is our founding director. Welcome, John. He's my wingman for this afternoon if anything happens on my call here. But yeah, coming on for our 20th anniversary, and predominantly for most of that time, it's been in education, and now solely in education contexts. And over that time, since 2002, it's grown. The name Australian Growth Coaching dropped after, I think, a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, as we started to do some work in New Zealand. And any of you in New Zealand will know that anything that's called Australia, from a market positioning point of view, doesn't go down well there. So it became Growth Coaching International. We can now say that we've grown and matured into a truly international organization. So John Campbell, our founding director, is based in Sydney, and our HQ is in Sydney. I'm presenting from Melbourne just now. My role as executive director now. Our global director is Professor Christian van Nieuwerburgh, who's based in the UK. And Christian is Professor of Coaching and Positive Psychology at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, now formerly University of East London. And you may well know of Christian and his academic profile already. And then through various partnerships around the world as well, we have a formal partnership with Instructional Coaching Group in the US, and Dr. Jim Knight at the University of Kansas there, and Professor Rachel Lofthouse at Collective Ed, the Centre for Coaching and Mentoring and Education at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. So we see ourselves very much as a training organisation, a coach training organisation positioned in education. We provide coaching, courses, consultancy, but also as a contributing organisation, as a bridging organisation through those partnerships and the roles of some of our senior staff, where we see ourselves as part of our vision is to contribute to the field, the emerging field of coaching and education. So again, through this presentation, I'd welcome your perspective on that as well. Very briefly about myself. Clearly, I've got a Scottish accent. You might have pinned that one already. I'm sitting here in Melbourne. I've got Australian citizenship. I've been here for over 10 years now with my family. We emigrated here in 2010. I've got a nice Australian passport, but I've not been able to use it to go anywhere yet because of the very obvious restrictions. So my next trip back home to Scotland will be on my Australian passport, which is quite something. But coming here has given me the chance to immerse myself in coaching and education. So I qualified as a teacher 30 years ago now. As a secondary teacher, I've had various school leadership roles through that time. And then for the 5 years before I came to Australia, I worked in teacher education, in initial teacher education at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and ended up running the 1 year postgraduate diploma in education for primary and secondary teachers there. And I think looking back now, I would say that I was doing coaching before I knew it was called coaching. At that time, in the late 2000s, coaching in education was not really a thing. It certainly wasn't in Scotland. And I look back at some of the conversations I had with student teachers, beginning teachers, and even in my teaching career before that, I think the better conversations were probably more coach-like. And the ones that were less successful were, well, maybe too hierarchical, maybe not clearly defined enough, maybe too adversarial, maybe too directive or top-down. So I've since seen the error of my ways and wish I'd known then what I know now about conversations, and became more and more interested in professional growth, professional development of teachers and educators, and how that led into school leadership and educational leadership. So then took the chance to come to Australia and worked in a couple of schools here in Australia for the first 6 years here, and worked in government and independent Catholic schools, and was responsible for leading professional learning, teacher professional learning, and initiating coaching in those schools. And then, as sometimes happens in your professional life, got the wonderful opportunity to come and work for Growth Coaching International, who had trained me as a coach here in Australia. And I've been doing my dream job for now 4 or 5 years, I think it is now, and now leading our global operations for GCI as Executive Director. So that's a whistle-stop tour of how I got to where I am. What I'd like to encourage you to do just now is just in the chat box, it would be nice just to introduce yourself. What do you do and where are you located? So just for a couple of minutes in the chat box, what's your story? Briefly, just so we can see who's here. I say there are only 12 participants here. There may be more people who rock up as we go along. And if you're watching this recording later, thank you for registering. There were 50 odd registrations earlier this morning for this. So it's a delight that this is of interest to people. So just in the chat box just now, if you can find that and type in, just say a little bit. So John's here. I've introduced John. Thanks for coming along, John. John is our founding director. He was one of the people around that kitchen table, John, nearly 20 years ago now. Yeah. So, John, hang on, I'm just going to make you co-host just in case anything happens here. So if my internet collapses, John will just keep you talking about anything coaching and education. He's very well qualified to do so. All right, so we've got an international group here already. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, so Tim, thank you. Especially nice to meet you as the EMCC Global Accreditation Manager. We've had a fair bit to do with you recently, and my colleagues have. Christopher, yeah, Germany, living in Taiwan. This still geeks me out that we've got such an international audience here. I was a technology teacher in a previous life, so being able to do this just is like science fiction to me. It would have been when I started my teaching career. And Aileen, lovely to have another fellow Scot here. John has Scottish ancestry, as you can probably tell from the name there as well. Yeah, lovely to have you here, Aileen. Yeah. Transformational coach and team coach, vet setting. Yep. So an education interest. Great. Deva. Yeah. And KL, another coach and training provider. Great. Thank you. And Neil. Yes. I didn't think it was a Portuguese accent there. Yeah. Great. Thank you. I think you get the prize for staying up latest to join us, or getting up earliest, depending on which way around it was. Thank you. Thanks, Ellen. Yep. teachers in early childhood. So again, we've been doing a bit of work in early childhood recently, actually, and the whole professionalising of the early childhood sector has led to a lot of interest in coaching and mentoring in there as well. Great, thank you. Andre, thank you. Independently, yep. So we're going to explore how coaching can be implemented in the education sector. So I'm not here to tell you how it's done or how it should be done, but certainly to present our thinking on it, present some frameworks for you that will hopefully generate some discussion. And that whole us building our collective knowledge and our perspective on how our work might be brought to have a positive influence in an education context, how it's similar, how it's different from other contexts. And I think there are some things that are uniquely different about doing this kind of work in an education context, but we'll get to that. And thanks, Mary. Yep. Forgive me, I've just used Mary, this kind of Scottish version. It might be Marie. By all means, chip in, Mary or Marie, and say hello. Yeah, retired primary teacher in Ireland. Lovely. Another Celtic cousin. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, and if you're in Ireland right now, it's a bit late for you as well, I believe. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time to introduce yourselves and for being here. So a range of perspectives, which I think is lovely. And with this size of group, we'll have a nice roundtable discussion. I will say, I excuse my accent less often these days than I did 10 years ago when I first came to Australia. But when I get excited, I go a little bit fast. And when I get excited, my Scottishisms come out a little bit more. So if you don't understand what I'm saying, if I am going too fast, please say. It's a bit of a waste of your time if you sit here for an hour not understanding what I'm saying. So please do interrupt me and ask me to repeat anything that you're unsure about. So thank you for that. All right, so let's jump in. And because I'm presenting from Australia, I would like to begin by, customary here, to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land from which I'm presenting today. And I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with us on the call today. One last bit of admin. This is in the registration page, but if you do want to connect with me, connect with GCI, like most of you, this is talking to a group of fellow enthusiasts here. I never pass up an opportunity to talk about coaching. And I never pass up an opportunity to talk about coaching and education. So if you want to keep the conversation going or ask any questions afterwards, or just connect on social media, the channels are there. I'm relatively busy on social media, particularly on Twitter. There's a real coaching and education community on there. But to some people, that's like a foreign planet to think about that. But if you want to connect on there, there's a really thriving coaching and education community there. And through the GCI handle, and our website, we put out a lot of resources into the field as well. So by all means, these will come up again at the end, and there's a way of subscribing and staying in touch. So just if you want those just now. Okay, so what I plan to do is do a little bit of framework thinking, a little bit of context, and some of my own and my colleagues' thinking about coaching and education, then have a brief breakout discussion. I might just split this group in two and just have a couple of groups. Just to discuss kind of what's resonating, what's challenging you about the things that I'm proposing, your take on it as fellow professionals in this space. And then coming back, do a little bit of a debrief, present a little bit more, come back, go out to breakouts again, come back and so on, and try and keep that going. And we're timing for about an hour and a quarter to an hour and a half, absolutely maximum. We'll see how we go. But I'm happy to make it blow out to conversations if we want to, and I'll just trim what I cover in my slides as we go. There aren't a lot of slides here. So I want to start by thinking about conversations in education settings in general. So when we think about conversations in education, we can, and it's variously been presented this way, as presenting these conversations on a continuum that go from completely non-directive conversations to highly directive conversations where there are child welfare issues, there are mandated procedures and processes that have to be in place, there's compliance things that have to be in place. So extreme ends of a continuum, if you like, and a whole range of conversational contexts in between. And I've written a little bit about this on one of the think pieces that I wrote for Collective Ed for Leeds Beckett University's coaching and mentoring journal. So I've got a bibliography at the end that will give you the references for these if you want. I'm happy to share the slides. So if we think about what the conversations look like in education settings at that non-directive end, we're talking about things like empathic listening, cathartic venting, socializing, sitting down together in the staff room in the school and having a chat that's unstructured, undirected. And you know what those social interactions look like in other social circumstances. They happen every day in school situations and other education settings as well. At the opposite end, and this is just a selection of terms that seem to capture what we're talking about here, those more directive conversations, not necessarily giving directives, although they could be at times, might be the kinds of conversations that center around appraisal of someone's performance. It might be around duty of care. And as you know, and Ellen, you mentioned early childhood, that one of the most pressing needs in early childhood setting is the duty of care, and a lot more compliance measures required there with some of our most vulnerable children. So duty of care, it might be compliance, it might be risk management, it might be unprofessional behaviour when someone is not doing the right thing, and I don't think that's unique to education. It doesn't need a coaching conversation. It might lead to a coaching conversation, but it needs a pretty direct conversation, a concern-based conversation, we might call it, at that end. And then the area where I hang out most in my day job, and where anyone in a school who or an other education setting who is trying to build the professional capacity of their colleagues, that are trying to develop the professional growth of their colleagues, that space is probably this middle section, that are more structured, more intentional types of conversations. And we'll put coaching and mentoring on this in a second. So the intent of these conversations in the middle is professional growth, critical reflection for the other, capacity building, we might say, skill development. It might be around particular skills, particular leadership skills, particular instructional or teaching and learning type skills. It might be around performance enhancement, that what's next for you in your career, what's next for you in your classroom practice. It might be around career development as well, you know, and progression through the system. So there would be conversations there that are to do with that. But the presumptions in this middle section of the continuum are these. So that these people are customers for change. I'm borrowing and paraphrasing from Mark McErgow. Mark McErgow is the director of solution-focused work in the UK. And again, someone we have a bit of a partnership with. And he talks about people needing to be customers for change before they become coachable. And you'll all have knowledge and insight into people's readiness for coaching. In education, we're saying, look, they need to come willingly to those kinds of conversations. And also what we're saying is that these conversations in that center section presume professionalism. It's not the place to have I'm concerned conversation. It's not a place to try and coach bad behavior or poor practice out of people. We might need to move temporarily to the directive end, or more towards the directive end, to share that concern. And we would hope that those concerns then lead back to that middle section where you're supporting the person to build their capacity out of that concern. And it presumes that teachers and other educators are always striving to get better at doing it. And I often quote our good friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Knight here, where he says that if you want to be in the group called professionals, if educators want to be in the group called professionals, an always present characteristic of a professional at anything is that they're always striving to get better at doing what they do. They're always looking for their next personal best. And if we position teachers in that space, then it generates a bit of the impetus and actually allows us to hold the bar high for what we expect here. So it presumes professionalism. And the flip side of that, you can't coach bad behavior out of people. You can't coach unprofessional behavior out of people. And for educators that we speak to, and particularly for school leaders, this way of presenting those conversations often resonates really strongly with them, that they start to become much more aware and intentional behind the intent of those conversations. So one more elaboration on this that I want to present to you, and then give you a chance to chew on this a little bit in a breakout room, have a little conversation with each other about this. So thinking then about that center section and calling it a continuum of professional learning conversations. So which of those conversations are really about professional learning, the professional growth of the other person? And again, in that same article, then taking this concept, building in Christian van Nieuwerburgh's work and others, I've forgotten the name, not Tim Galway, it'll come back to me later. In terms of thinking about this continuum, there's been various continua in the coaching literature over the years, sometimes to do with the skills of a coach and where some of the skills are leading you in a more directive direction, some less directive. When Christian van Nieuwerburgh first presented this, he talked about directive and non-directive. And actually, there's a very deliberate choice of language there in less directive and more directive. So as we move to the right in the continuum, we, as the coach, are becoming more directive. And another way of thinking about that might be, there's more of my voice in the conversation. There's more of my knowledge and expertise and wisdom that person might need if I'm moving more towards the directive end. It's not about a coach giving directives. It's about advocating maybe a particular way of doing something. So unpacking that a little bit more starts to bring some clarity to some of those terms. So if we think about this concept of stance on this continuum, we can slide, and whenever I talk about this continuum, I kind of move from side to side like this. A less directive end would probably be a facilitative stance. And at the more directive end, I'm taking a more directive stance. So what do those look like? Somewhere in the middle, it's probably what we would call a dialogic stance. My colleague Jim Knight calls it a dialogical stance. But a dialogic stance is somewhere in the middle. At the directive end, the kinds of things we would expect to see there, if I were taking that stance, I'd be advocating the way forward. I'd be providing direction and advice. Very deliberate choice of words there. I might be explaining actions or next steps. I might even put some kind of training function in there where I'm having to teach the person how to do something that they don't know how to do. That would be adopting a more directive stance in that professional learning conversation. If we go to, for most of us here as coaches, to a more facilitative stance, a more familiar stance, it's a stance of inquiry. It's about tapping into the coachee's resources rather than mine. It's about adopting a beginner's mind. And when we talk to educators about this, it doesn't, sometimes what they come back with is, does that mean that none of my expertise and wisdom and knowledge is important or of value? I'm so used to helping them by telling them what I think and sharing my knowledge with them. This sounds like I'm denying that or I'm withholding that. And withholding is a very pejorative term in that context. So what does that beginner's mind mean? It means I'm setting aside my knowledge and expertise, my own talk and thinking about their solutions until it's absolutely necessary. And I might need to shift towards the right-hand end of that continuum to share some of that. And my main motive here is to elicit deep thinking in the coachee or the mentee. I'm starting to introduce those terms as well, in the other person. In the dialogic stance, there's kind of a meeting of the minds. I'm thinking with the coachee. I'm sharing options as needed. And please note the difference between sharing options as needed and giving direction and advice. Wrestling with the words here has been part of what's happened in the thinking around this. And I might explain strategies, but I might still explain those strategies in a provisional way, in a tentative way, so that the coachee or mentee can take those and shape them and contextualize them so they become theirs, as opposed to at the directive end, that it's more definite in terms of what I'm offering. Thinking about that continuum then and applying some labels, I'm hoping, and certainly when we talk to educators about this, that you'll agree that the ones in the orange box, or the characteristics in the orange box, are what we would typically describe as coaching. And mentoring is typically described in the literature as what's at the right-hand end. And when we present this to educators, we often get, that resonates, or, I'm called a mentor, but I'm doing more of that stuff. Or I'm called a coach, but I actually spend most of my time doing that stuff. And other people will propose, and I don't disagree, that if I'm a really good mentor, I'm probably doing a hell of a lot of the stuff that's at the left-hand end of that continuum a lot of the time. And I'm probably doing a lot of the dialogic stance if I'm a really good mentor. Now, what I would say as the last clarification on this is one of the distinguishing features here for me as well, is that in the coaching box there, the coachee is always the driver. They are always positioned as the key decision maker. When I move to a more mentoring stance or a more directive stance, it's for a period of time anyway, I might be saying to the coachee, move over and let me drive. That I'm asking them to watch, I'm asking them to learn from me before letting them back in to that seat. Now, if I click back, here's the last point, and I take the titles coaching and mentoring off that slide, and I show it to school leaders, and I show it to coaches, mentors, professional learning leaders, learning specialists, pedagogical coaches, mentors of teaching and learning. The list goes on of what these people in schools are called. There are an increasing number of roles in schools where people have been given coaching and mentoring type roles to develop the practice and capacity of their colleagues. When I ask the question, does that slide now without the labels on it describe everything you might have to do and describe the stances you might have to take with anyone in your organization at any given time? Does that capture it? The overwhelming response is yes, it certainly does. And I'm less worried now about whether I'm called a mentor, called a coach. The overwhelming message from this is that the role title doesn't define the work. That what I'm called in a school doesn't define what other people might need from me. If we're talking about supporting the professional learning of people in schools, the slide as it is just now, without the names coaching and mentoring on it, probably captures all the different things that people need from me at different times. So with that as a bit of a provocation and a bit of a stimulus for conversation, what I'd like to do is put you out in the breakout rooms and just ask you to discuss that. So what resonates with you there? What challenges you? What questions or comments do you have on that? And bring those back. I'm going to say I'll give you a 7-minute conversation to chew on that. It's quite a bit in that. That's okay. So we'll get the breakouts done. So let me see, we're down to 11 people now. So let me just put you into 2 groups of 5 or 6 people. Yeah, so it's groups of 5 or 6. And let me just do a little bit of shuffling there. Got that. I'll put 7 on the clock and a 30-second countdown. Okay, so you'll get a countdown. You can use all the time. It will send you out and it will pull you back. If you're confused or lost or you want my contribution, then there's a little ask for help button that you can click. But otherwise, I'll see you in 7.5 minutes. See what you've got for me then. All right, off we go. Welcome back. Okay, so I'm just going to keep you on gallery mode just now. Again, nice group size, nice and compact, so we can do this as a whole group debrief. What resonated and/or challenged you in terms of that framework that I've presented there? It's still a bit of a work in progress, but it's becoming a little bit more concrete as we work with it. Who'd like to comment on that? By all means, if you don't want to speak in front of the group, use the chat box to do that as well, or do both. Do both, and I'll pick some out of there as well.
Just quickly, Chris, are you talking about mentees and coachees who are students of educators, or are you talking about education leaders who are talking to their peers and other professionals? I wasn't quite clear.
Well, that's a really good question, Tim, because I'm going to talk about those other contexts in a second in the next part. Really, that framework is thinking about the adult to adult conversations in the school. So it's thinking about, well, 2 things. There's an increasing number of people in schools who are designated as coaches, and there's always been mentors. And that term has been thrown around without necessarily there ever been any training or skill or understanding. It's just another person who knows the job to tell you how to do it, kind of thing. There's an increasing number of coaches and instructional coaches in schools. But equally, that could apply to leaders taking what we call a coaching approach or a coaching stance in their leadership. And I know that's a space that lots of you are in education and other contexts. So yeah, I'd be interested in your perspective on that. Yeah. If you want to tell me it's nonsense and makes no sense, that would be helpful feedback as well. Yeah, Ellen, you're unmuted there. You want to add something?
Yeah, it's more of a question, actually. So in the discussion room, I think most of us find it it resonates a lot, what you have been sharing, that as a mentor, we sort of shift. And like you said, most of the time, as a good mentor, we will stay dominantly on the left-hand side, though we may at times move on the right-hand side.
Yep.
So my experience in my country is more helping more mentors that help to develop teachers of early childhood education, especially in the rural area, because that's the most lacking, especially in the personal growth. But the biggest challenge is really our culture we have a very strong patriarchal culture. It's like a very strong top-down culture. And it's shifting them from the right hand to the left hand is really a very long process, because it's like unpacking a lot of mindset that they carried like for decades.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if there's any experience or studies that you may have to help just enrich it.
Yes. Yeah. So not in terms of studies that I could direct you to as such, but the work of our global director, Christian van Nieuwerburgh, he's done a fair bit of work in the intercultural coaching space. He's written a book called Coaching in the Islamic World, for example, with a colleague in Kuwait. He's done a lot of work in the Middle East on those kind of cultural differences, and even points of reference, terminology, societal expectations. I think there are really fascinating issues here that are intercultural, but there's also a human tendency to that right-hand end as well. When I present that to, I don't know how, I'm very wary that you start to talk in cultural stereotypes if you're not careful in this kind of discussion, but I present this to the educators I work with in Australia, who are pretty multicultural, but very westernized, I suppose, in their outlook. Where do you hang out most on that continuum? Where's your default setting on that continuum? The number of them that go to the right-hand side is phenomenal. And if you read Edgar Schein's work, for example, so Edgar Schein's written a book called Helping, about our tendencies, and he reckons it's a Western norm that when you see someone stuck, your automatic response is to tell them what you think. We're serial advice givers, according to him. And he also makes the point that there's a very seductive draw in advice giving. It makes us feel leaderly, makes us feel worthy and valuable when we tell others what we think, when we impart our expertise. But he also makes the case that creates an unhelpful status difference between us and the other person. So that concept of partnership and equals may well be a bigger challenge in certain cultural contexts. I think you're right. And I've heard that from participants as well. And Christian has worked in the Islamic world, but again, in Southeast Asia and so on. And yeah, you're right, those patriarchal societies. So there's a bit of an adjustment in people's settings, and a bit of what we're having to do, even with the groups that we work with, is help them to experience the benefits of sitting at that left-hand end for longer. We're not saying you don't go there. We're not saying you deny or withhold your expertise. But what's important is don't just believe me, witness the difference it makes to that person. Do you want them to be empowered? Do you want them to have agency? Do you want them to think for themselves? Well, actually, all the research around self-determination theory and all the other theories that you guys know about underpin our work says that actually you should hang out at that left-hand end for longer. Hang in there. It's hard. It's not your default. It's not where you really want to go because you feel that you're not being helpful anymore. And when the light bulb comes on and they realize this is a different way of being really helpful. In fact, this is a more sustainable way of being helpful, rather than feeding people with the answers that they want, they then turn that corner and they become coaches like us. They see the light in a way that they go, oh, right, okay, this is a different way of helping. Whereas initially they think, I'm not being helpful anymore because I'm not telling them what I've got. Does that make sense? Yeah. And Neil, you had your hand up for a minute there. Were you going to add something or ask a question?
One of the things I shared with the group, I've got a class at the moment of teachers. They're about 13, 14 teachers. And we're looking at mentoring in education. So it's how to set up a mentoring project within your school, whether that be peer mentoring with students, whether that be peer mentoring with teachers. We look at instructional coaching. We read the first chapter of Jim Knight's book on instructional coaching, which they like. But they get caught up with the terms mentor and coach and trying to figure out what those mean. So what I said in the group is I found it really helpful then that you went through the model, the scheme here, But then you said, well, what if we take these words away and then we look at it as just at what people are doing, which I think can be helpful to stop people getting hung up on the titles, because we're not going to come to a conclusion of what is mentoring, what is coaching. Somebody will always come up with some reason why it's the other way around. I thought it was good to show it and then take it away. I thought that was interesting.
And thank you for that feedback, because that's evolved as I've been presenting it in response to questions like that, because people will then say things like, oh, so does it just not matter? We'll just call it whatever we like. But well, actually, when you read the research, one of the first things you want to do, and you all know that it's poorly defined sometimes, one of the things I want to know is, what is this thing that you're calling mentoring or coaching in your research study? And you'll hear people say, oh, instructional coaching, that's just the same as mentoring. That's when you tell them how to do stuff. I'm hosting a webinar on Wednesday morning with Jim Knight and Rachel Lofthouse and Christian van Nieuwerburgh to discuss just that, because there's a misconception out there that coaches tell people what to do and instructional coaches give instructions. It's a really surface level interpretation of that. It's more about the intent and the expectation and the topic of the coaching, rather than the word instruction. So I think that's really important. That's great feedback, Neil. We're not saying you don't need the labels. And when you're a beginner at anything, you latch on to labels and you're very rules driven. And what we know about coach development, and you've all been through this journey, that you are quite rules driven to start with. And it is a bit procedural and almost transactional. When it becomes more transformative, that's when you're much more comfortable in the moment and the not knowing. But educators who are learning to do this and learning to adopt a different way of operating in conversations, we've got to remember as trainers that that's quite a transformation that we're asking them to go on for lots of them. And it's often not the way they've been trained. It's not the way they've had professional learning. It's not the way they've been led. So a lot of the challenge and the satisfaction in our space working on this with educators is they've often operated quite differently, or they've been in cultures that are very top down, whether that be a culture, a societal culture, or be a school culture, So there's lots in that, lots of layers under that. But the first layer is, what's this difference between coaching and mentoring? Because they're often conjoined and conflated in the literature, in education in particular. And increasingly, we're managing to tease them out. And this is an attempt at doing that. I'm not saying it's right, but it's a framework that has emerged out of that thinking. Yeah, great. Thank you for that discussion and those questions. And there's a bit more in there. Thank you, Mari. I know you're having trouble today. You can't join in the breakouts. Thank you for contributing there. So Mari's posted a comment there in the chat box. But again, the article link is there. I've got the references at the end. By all means, go in and engage in that discussion further and send me further comments. At some stage, John's here to witness this. It might be the subject of my own doctorate at some stage. I'm still scratching that itch, but who knows when I'll get time to do that. But actually taking that framework and testing it and looking at how it actually looks in reality is something I'd be interested in pursuing from an academic point of view as well. Yeah. And the point you've made there, Marie, just to pick that up, awareness of how powerful the coaching relationship can be, the non-judgmental, powerful questions, coaching alliance. That's an interesting word. We often talk about partnership. I like alliance as well. Holding the space. So when we take that continuum and I put it to beginners or experienced leaders, and I say, right, how do you discern? I think the word discernment is important. The skill here is in discerning, where do I need to be? Where do I need to be as the coach or mentor or whatever I'm called on that continuum at any given time? So it's not just I'm always this. Somebody might need one thing from me at one point in the conversation and need me to shift stance. So that conscious shifting of stance, I think, is important, that discernment, but also how do I need to be? Not just where do I need to be? How do I need to show up for this person right now? So there's a lot of layers we could unpack underneath that. Yeah. So that's kind of grounding and kind of trying to convey how I see it, and you've added some lovely comments and feedback to that. Thank you. So I'm just going to move on and present you with the definition of coaching that we hang our hat on. Because Christian van Nieuwerburgh has been involved with us for a while, he wrote a book, the first book, I think, on coaching and education in 2012. And he came up with this definition, and it's one that we hang our hats on. There are well-worked definitions out there. You'll know John Whitmore's definition and various others. But in an education context, this was the one that popped out. And I think it covers a lot in terms of skills, intention, way of being, expectation. And when I present this to educators, what I often do, and I won't do it just now just for time, is I ask the group to take the annotate tool and highlight the 3 key words that resonate most with them. And when I've got a room full of educational leaders looking at this, and they underline words like enhancement and personal responsibility, well, you think, well, okay, that's kind of what leaders would want as teachers to be taking responsibility. But then they get really excited about self-directed learning. The word supportive is probably the one that's highlighted more than anything else. Now, for me, my response to that in a workshop is always, wow, I'd love to work with you guys, because that's the kind of school I would have wanted to work in, and did some of my career and didn't at other times in my career, where really, when you ask educational leaders what they want a high-functioning staff who think, who have agency, who critically reflect, but don't see it as a threatening thing. They see it as a routine part of their role, that they're constantly striving to meet the needs of the children in front of them, and that they accept that requires that level of professionalism where we're always thinking about what we do and modifying and adapting. And they want people to bounce into review conversations and performance and development conversations, saying to them, I've been working with a coach this year, look what I've achieved, and here's what I've learned, and here's the journey I've been on. But what they get just now very often is teachers coming into their performance and development conversations saying, what do you want to hear? And telling them what they want to hear, and they get passive compliance. So this whole thing about empowerment and agency and acting in context in a conscious way is really what most education leaders, certainly that we work with, want to see. So that definition resonates with them. So for the rest of the presentation, what I want to do is jump in and out of this framework. So this is the global framework for coaching and mentoring in education. It was developed by, and John, I should really let you talk to this, but I'm going to talk to it with you sitting in the corner here. Christian van Nieuwerburgh, Jim Knight, and John Campbell. And John would be too humble to say this, but I would say 3 global thought leaders in the field of coaching and education in particular, who've done more work in that area probably than anybody else. And from different places, from executive coaching direction and from teacher professional learning direction. So Jim's work has very much evolved over 20 years now of really solid research in instructional coaching, out of that thing that most of us as teachers and educators know to be true, that most professional learning events that you run for teachers that are spray and pray, as the Americans call them, or sit and get, where you spray stuff at people and hope some of it sticks, does very, very little to change classroom practice. Millions of dollars wasted on whole, one size fits all PD. And Jim's, the seed of Jim's research in his doctoral studies originally was that dawning that as a special educator, the PD programs he was running were getting great reviews and good feedback from participants, but when they then followed up to see if it had made a difference in the classroom, very little had changed. And you won't find a room full of educators anywhere in the world who don't sit and nod as you're telling them that story, because we've all been subjected to lots and lots of PD over the years. And I deliberately use the word subjected to. So Jim's work has come from that direction. Christian and John, yes, from education backgrounds, yes, from impacting on student outcomes, but more from bringing what do we know about executive coaching and leadership coaching in other fields, and how can that be brought to bear and have a positive impact in an education context. And in the last 10 years, that overlap has been like a big Venn diagram where we're actually sharing the same values, experiences, intent behind our work. And that's partly what led to the partnership with ICG. So this framework was a way of trying to capture we've called them various things, but the landscape or the environment, the playing field, if you like, the educational environment for coaching and mentoring in education. And I'm saying coaching and mentoring now, knowing that I've put that continuum in front of you and you can see the breadth of the way I use those terms. And at the heart of this framework, and this is actually version 2 of it, is what it's all about. It's all about student success and well-being. So it's student outcomes, but saying success and well-being, I think, is even more specific. So the portals, or for context, conversational contexts or portals, you might call them, are areas where there is some research, and certainly there's lots and lots of evidence of educators that we've all worked with applying coaching and coaching approaches. So again, back to that point, Tim, that you raised earlier, not just pure coaching or formal coaching, but actually those informal conversations where, and John and I are working on a book on this at the moment, where those corridor conversations, those have you got a minute conversations, those leadership conversations, the leader is actually, or the conversation leader even, is spotting the opportunity for that conversation to be what you might call a coachable moment, to deploy some of the transferable skills, techniques, way of being even, and how they show up in the moment in those shorter, less formal interactions, so that a range of conversations all around the school start to look more coach-like. And that's different from saying we all coach around here now, we're all coaches. I've seen schools do that and it fall flat on its face, because you're not all coaches, but you're all having more intentional conversations. Let's be really clear what we're doing here. So this provides for us when we talk to clients and we talk to educators, it kind of bookends our training programs as a lens for the educators to think about, where are you going to go and apply this? Or what's your role just now in your school and your organization? And where do you want to see the stuff you're learning here about coaching and coaching approaches to conversations? Where do you want to see it make a difference? Where will be the positive impact in your organization as a result of you learning about coaching, mentoring, and everything in between? So if we then delved into each of those portals, the most common one to start with is educational leadership. Most commonly, we get educational leaders coming to us for training, or educational leaders being coached on their leadership. So separating those out, the kinds of things we're talking about there are things like educational leaders receiving coaching. And I don't need to tell you, most of you are involved in executive coaching, that the benefits there are that safe space to reflect, to plan, to lead with greater strategic clarity, to build their confidence, to build their sense of agency, to act in their context. Yeah. Another side of that is that coaching approach. It's educational leaders adopting coaching as a way of leading. And we're seeing that emerge as a stronger and stronger area where coaching and coaching approaches are being applied. And the intent there is to better support and engage their colleagues and their teams in a way that promotes ownership, responsibility, professionalism. And again, when you ask them what they want, it's those words that come out. So my question to you for just another quick breakout, I'm just going to put you out for 5 minutes this time, probably a little bit longer on this one and shorter than the others. Very quick conversation. Where would you say the conversational contexts are? Or if I ask a better question as a coach, that might actually help, wouldn't it? As a question, I'm just going to post it in the chat box for you. Here's your question for your breakout. Okay, what are the conversational contexts in that educational leadership portal where coaching and coaching approaches can help? So if I said, where would we notice that? Where would we see that happening? Where would a leader apply it? And what would be the outcome of that? What would you say? Yeah, so I'll give you 5 minutes. I'm just going to put you back in the same groups for the first one, and then I'll shuffle you for the next one. What do you think in response to that? All right, a quick debrief. What contexts did you come up with for those conversations where coaching and mentoring, or the skills, might have a positive effect? Just got some suggestions, or post them in the chat box. I can read them there. And I'm presuming, and from what, go on, Neil.
Tim mentioned meetings, how the conversations could be more a coaching conversation in meetings. Would be very helpful, which I think is not generally approach that people who are running meetings tend to take.
Yeah.
I mentioned meetings even meetings in the hallway, crossing and having a quick question or a quick something. People don't have the patience to ask a question or help the person rely on themselves. Rather, it's just a quick fix, just answer the question and move on.
Yeah. And then complain that people keep coming back to be fed. Yeah.
I mentioned that about a CEO that I work with for 2 years. He was like, he said, I don't have the patience to coach. I just tell him what to do. And after 2 years, he's coming back and saying, people are just asking me questions all the time. They're always relying on my answers. Nobody takes any initiative. And I said, yeah, who created that monster?
That's right. How did that work out for you? Yeah. So and that comes up quite frequently. Again, if you ask, what's your key takeout for today at the start of our leadership coaching workshops, I had one principal who said, oh, I want to have more efficient conversations. And I kind of held my breath and went, tell me more about efficient. What do you mean? And then when he saw a coaching demonstration, he actually said in the feedback, that's it. That's what I want. He said, because I feel as though I'm having to do all this empathic listening and just let them vent. And then they wait for me to tell them what they should do, or and it's taken too much of my time. He said that was really, and he pointed out that it was managed. It was a managed or structured conversation where the other person did most of the thinking and took responsibility. And it led us nicely into, John Whitmore's 2 outcomes of coaching, awareness and responsibility. If that's what you want more of, then fine, I'm happy with the word efficient. If it means efficient in terms of just tell them, then, let's see how that works out. Yeah. We've got the examples to prove that that's not as helpful as you think it is. Is it Michael Bungay-Stanier who says, one of his mantras is, your advice isn't as good as you think it is. Just have that stuck on your wall above your desk as a principle. Yeah. Aileen, thank you.
Myself, we didn't discuss it in the meeting, but it's something that keeps coming back to me. I think that the leader, the principal, is really the start of your, the process. It's the role model that he creates by having those coaching like conversations, whether he does it as a formal accredited coach or there's learning to be curious. And as you said, manage the conversations in an effective way. We had a system, I worked for accountants for years, but we had a system that you don't come to my door unless you have a solution. So it's to encourage people not to come just with the problem, but to come with the problem in the way that you want to do it. And often we do jump into being directive, but if somebody does come saying, well, I've got this idea, then that's also that coaching conversation with the leader. And I think it filters down. And the other thing, I don't know if you're going to discuss it, is that I think that role modeling filters down, not just through the principal to the teacher, but to the children. And as John was saying before we finished, it can go really into how we manage parents and who are upset about their kids. So I think the whole model and the way of dealing with this has got a lot of different ways of managing the situations within it, whether it's the leader or the teacher is a leader, because everybody can be a leader.
Completely agree, Aileen. And maybe we should have put that up front. When I say leadership, I mean anyone with any kind of who's seeking to influence the thinking or behavior of another. And in modern schools, then that's quite a distributed, quite a flat model leadership structure. Yeah. And yes, we do see that ripple. One of my real interests is in cultures and schools. And that's what we see as one of those signs that there's a ripple effect when you start somewhere. And that's partly what that global framework conveys is these could be starting points. This is the most common starting point. And often it's quite a traditional view that starts that. They think, we've got to learn as the bosses, and then it will cascade, which I have an aversion to that word. It will cascade somehow to everybody else. I think it needs much more intentionality behind it than just thinking it'll happen by osmosis. But there is something to be said for that it's the modeling, it's the role modeling, it's the walking the talk. And people go, this feels different from the kinds of conversations we've had before. What are you noticing that is different, and what are you noticing is different as a result of you having more of those conversations? That's where you turn the corner with school leaders, I think, that they go, that's what I want. The outcome of these conversations is what I want. It's not mind tricks that they're playing. The ones who come to the program and in the first 5 minutes, they're thinking, right, I know how I want to do this too. I know who I want to fix with this. You've got to kind of say to them, wait a minute, how's that going to work out for you as well? They're going to see right through that. If it feels like manipulation, you're doing it wrong. So all of that we have to unpack. I think we know as coaches and mentors here that it's very nuanced, but when beginners come to try and learn to operate this way, back to that again, there's a lot of layers to this that you've got to gradually build up over time. That they and noticing the difference that it's making in these different portals or contexts, I think, is part of that. Great, thank you, and thanks for keeping on adding to the discussion in the background there as well. Great. So I want to try and go through, give you at least another 1-2 maybe discussions, but go through the other portals. And I'm going to privilege the leadership one and the student one. You mentioned it there, Aileen, and talk you through the others. I'm conscious that I think this was advertised as finishing at 2:15, but I think there was a mix up there. I think I was given a choice between 75 and 90 minutes. So I probably will go to 1/2 if you can hang on.
It's okay to go.
Is that okay, Tim? Thank you. Thank you. Otherwise, I'd be just sending you the slides and saying off you go. So that would be nice. So let's look at the others then. So again, you can see how this framework, this has become a useful lens or starting point when we start to talk to schools who come to us and say, look, I want a coaching culture. Well, the first question is, well, what will that look like, obviously? But where might you start? Who might you start with? What kind of training do they need? What kind of, how will that play out? How does that fit with your current context? And the antecedent conditions is another phrase that often comes up there. So if we think about the professional practice portal or context, it's really about the professional practice of educators. Now, that could be everything. That can be everything they do. Initially, the conceptualization of that was around a lot of Jim Knight's work in instructional coaching, which is really coaching around teaching practice, around teaching and learning, around pedagogy, you might call it. And this is where teachers and other educators who receive coaching in relation to their professional practice, they experience that increased self-efficacy and then building collective efficacy. And they're able to sustain the implementation of new practices. So some of what came out there was around that lack of impact of professional learning. And you may be aware of the work of Thomas Guskey and Joyce and Showers and so on way back, where they did some really rigorous studies that have been repeated since that demonstrated the missing ingredient in traditional PD, professional development, was actually that follow-up support. And they weren't called coaches to start with. That language then emerged a little bit later. But someone who would help you go through that change process so that the new practice that you really genuinely wanted to implement actually stuck. You formed new habits in order to meet the needs of the students. And then in recent years, doing some work in instructional coaching myself, what's become really clear there is the way you set goals in that space. That when you define goals in coaching in that space, you're really defining them in terms of the outcomes you want to see for the students. And traditionally, a lot of coaches operating in that space defined their goals in terms of teacher practice. So teachers could say, yes, I'm doing that strategy. But the question remained, and what difference is it making to the students? So when we get teachers to articulate their goals in terms of student outcomes, we see that the emotionally compelling aspect of the goal really coming to the fore. We see the powerful difference it's going to make, and we really enhance the motivation of the teacher rather than it being just a practice that they're going to implement. So there's some subtleties and differences in even the language of goal setting in that portal. And then thinking about, and this is the one you kind of alluded to there, Aileen, is the teachers and other educators using coaching skills to improve the quality of dialogue in general. And that might mean providing feedback to each other. It might mean peer-to-peer. So not necessarily designated coach and coachee, but actually reciprocal pairs of teachers adopting the coaching or mentoring role. They obviously need some training and rigor in that. But so that we actually do classroom observations and collegial visits, things that are sometimes mandated in our schools, we do them so much better. Just now, a lot of them become tick box exercises for compliance purposes. If we want those to be a valuable use of time and to really build collegiality and collaboration and trust, we really need to invest much more in the how we have those conversations. So peer-to-peer, designated coach to teachers and positioned as a professional learning service are where we see that work really well in schools. Designated instructional coaches, or whatever they want to call them, mentors with training, whereas often the mentor is the person who's the head of department who had their arm put up their back to look after the new teacher anyway. How we work with student teachers, graduate teachers to really build their practice over time. And then the other aspect of that is actually middle leadership. So heads of department, heads of year level in primary and secondary schools, for example, how do they adopt a coaching approach to building the professional practice of their teams? So again, coaching as a way of leading teams as well would sit in that sphere. It kind of links to diagonally to the educational leadership sphere, but thinking about that's probably one of the key outcomes of the leadership coaching and the coaching approach. You want to impact on the professional practice of your teams and your staff. Thinking about community engagement is probably the least well developed, but it's one of those ones that we do see that ripple getting to eventually in schools that have been doing this for a while. So it's really about educational institutions connecting to their communities and engaging their communities. And and all that, and certainly in Australia, the breadth of educational context is huge. The different faith-based schools, public sector, independent sector, faith sector, there's a much more complex mix of what constitutes a school community or an education community in Australia, certainly than I saw in Scotland. But really what we're talking about here is teachers and leaders deploying their coaching skills with parents, with carers, with members of the school community. It might be the school board, it might be the governors, it might be at parent-teacher interviews. And really what we're looking for there, we're looking for similar things to what we're looking for with our teaching staff or with anyone we're coaching. It's authentic engagement, it's collaboration, it's ownership, it's a voice. So what we're finding is that the intentional use or deployment of those skills and techniques, and even in the contentious situations, as was mentioned earlier, difficult conversations with parents, that actually those skills can be really powerful in managing challenging conversations or even de-escalating challenging conversations. And then that notion of multiple stakeholders, when we're engaging with the school community in terms of planning, in terms of projects, even out into co-curricular and external activities, just admitting somebody else here, bringing a coaching approach to that. And one of my colleagues in Scotland is actually doing some work in a school there where she's providing coaching training for parents so that they are better able to support their teenage sons and daughters when they're going through their exams and so on. Now you can imagine, if many of you are probably parents, the delicacies of that and the complexities of that. It's not quite as straightforward as it sounds, but it's an interesting context for us to think about in terms of what does the wider school community beyond teachers, leaders, students look like? How can we have that ripple of coaching influence moving beyond that? And then the final one, and I'll give you a chance to go out and have another conversation about this in a second, is the student experience. So there's two levels, and there is some good research emerging in this, and Christian van Nieuwerburgh's led quite a bit of this. We're talking about teachers with coaching skills having more positive, possibly solution-focused conversations with students. So again, taking account of that power dynamic that exists, that status dynamic. Often we're asked, is it just the same when you're coaching students? Well, I think there's two reasons why it can't be the same. One is there's an inbuilt status and power difference between teacher and student. Whether you like it or want it or not, it exists. Almost the parent-child kind of relationship there. There's also that expectation that the teacher will tell me the right thing to do. The teacher has all the answers. So that knowledge and expertise thing. And I think the other factor that kicks in here is you're not coaching fully formed adults at this point. And we've seen coaching been done really successfully with primary age students and pupils. And actually, students being trained as coaches as young as primary and doing it really, really well. So we're seeing a real growth in that area, a real interest in that area around schools looking to enhance student agency, enhance student voice, and so on. So thinking about the use of strengths and some of the positive psychology programs that are out in schools, coaching as a way of operationalizing that. Obviously, goal striving and goal setting is a key aspect there, but it's all about increasing student agency. And then student coaching conversations, students actually supporting each other and enhancing current buddy systems and mentoring systems that appear in schools, bringing a bit more structure and rigor to those is another real growth area where we're seeing a real appetite for that. as you can imagine, one of the key things there is that the people running it in the school need a high degree of expertise and understanding of coaching and mentoring and counselling and the boundaries and so on, and all the ethical things that us as coaching professionals have, but they might not have. So part of our role in supporting them with these kind of programs is helping them think about the dynamic of it, think about things like communication to parents, think about ethical boundaries. You know, all you can imagine some of the territory you could get into if you just let students loose with this and say, go and help each other. It's not quite as simple as that. So it needs some boundaries around it. So my final little breakout for you before we pull this together is just to think about those remaining portals, maybe particularly that student one. Again, what are the conversational contexts? If you unpack those outside, what were the contexts where, you know, we might see that happen? So we've got 2 new groups. I've just shuffled you around. I've not checked to see what kind of overlap there is there. I'm going to give you another 5 minutes to go out and have a chat about that, and then we'll wrap things up when you come back. All right, off we go. All right, we're out of time, I'm afraid, and I'm on strict instructions not to keep you late. So I'm going to leave you with one parting thought on that rather than do a debrief on that. I'm just going to post in the chat box a link to some of the articles that are mentioned in the presentation there. By all means, take those. That'll be shared afterwards as well. But the last thing I want to leave you with is as a kind of culmination of all of that, my colleagues, Christian van Nieuwerburgh and Margaret Barr and I wrote a chapter last year, or was published last year. We wrote it over quite a period of time on coaching cultures for learning. And I think what's come out of that global framework work that Jim and John and Christian have done is this notion of what would a coaching culture look like? And this is something I grappled with back in schools, you know, over the last 10 years as well. And we came up with this definition. It's quite a long definition, but this is the one that's published in this book. It's called Sustaining Depth and Meaning in School Leadership. The references in the slides at the end, I'll give you. But we wrote this chapter about our experience of coaching cultures. And this notion that it exists probably, if you want to look at the global framework, when you start to see what you said there, Aileen, that ripple of an influence of coaching in all those different portals or contexts. So, you know, education leaders, teachers, support staff, students, parents, and other partners intentionally using coaching and coaching approaches in a range of contexts. So that's the global framework. But going further than that, for that to happen, our proposition is that coaching approaches should be widely understood and skillfully utilised across the school community. It's not a matter of doing a 2-hour workshop and saying, right now we're all coaches, off you go and do it. We know there's a bit more to it than that. But then even further, taking that to its full conclusion, when that exists solidly and sustainably in a school, that it becomes part of the organisation's way of being. We often talk about a coaching way of being as an individual. What we're proposing is that actually you start to see an organisational way of being emerge. This is just how we talk around here. Rather than how we do things around here, this is how we relate around here. And then finally, what cements it is that there is actually appropriate resourcing and explicit integration into the school strategic plans. And we are now starting to see that. There are some great case studies in Australia of schools where that is actually embedded in role descriptions, it's embedded in strategic plans, and it's seen as not an add-on, but an integral and even a catalyzing part of professional learning and professional learning architecture in schools. So I'll leave you with that thought. The link that I posted in the chat box has actually the chapter freely available, so you don't need to go and buy the book. I'm now allowed to share it with you. So if you want to read that and have a look, and by all means, stay in touch and give me any comments that you have. As I said at the start, I never pass up an opportunity to talk about coaching and education. I'm one of the lucky people who gets to do what's become a passion, and I get to do it for a living now. So my contact details are there. The QR code or the address, if you go to our website, you can sign up for our updates, and it's not advertising of courses. Not that any of you would need that. It's about the resources that we're developing and think pieces and so on. So leave that with you. And then the slides can be shared afterwards, and you can grab the references and things from there. So 3 minutes over. Thank you so much for kicking off the conference, kicking off the summit. Thank you. It's such a joy. I am geeking out at this, that we're from all over the world here. It's great. Thank you for staying up very late, Neil. You do get the prize for that one. everyone else, and lovely to meet some new Australian locals as well. And I wish you well for the rest of the summit. I might see you in some other sessions. I've booked my own sessions, and Tim, I've got yours booked in for later today. If the rest of the workload today goes according to plan, I'll be there.
It's actually in half an hour, 25 minutes.
Should be there. All right. Great. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. Take care. Stay well. All right.